Hi, I'm Carl Weber. Welcome to Video-Aided Instruction series on writing a great research paper. In this program, we'll be talking about how to get started in research. But let's begin by recapping what we covered in our first program. Now, if you're watching this series, you are probably a student who needs to write a research paper, and your teacher probably assigned you a broad subject area. In our first program, we talked about how to narrow that broad subject area into a more manageable topic, one that's suitable for a paper that might run 10 to 15 pages in length. You've developed an interesting question to focus on that's related to that topic. As we saw, a challenging question that you can answer in 10 to 15 pages is one of the key things you need before you begin work on your paper. And you've also created a working thesis. The thesis is the hypothetical answer that you've created to the question that you're asking. It's an answer that you're going to test as you do your research. So once you have a manageable topic and an interesting question to focus on and a working thesis, you're ready now to actually begin the research, which will develop the basic materials for your paper. Now that you're ready to start your research, you'll be looking for materials that will help you to answer the key question you've decided and either modify, strengthen, challenge, or illustrate your main thesis. Remember, the whole point of your research is to test whether your working hypothesis is correct or not. And so you want to examine all the research materials in the light of your thesis and see what impact they have on the thesis. You may find by the time you complete your research that you've changed your thesis dramatically. You may decide that your original working hypothesis isn't correct at all. Or you may find that the evidence strongly supports the original thesis you came up with. Either way is fine. The point is to let the thesis guide your research and then let the research lead you where it will. The whole point of the research process is to come as close as possible to the truth and then write a paper that embodies what you've learned. Now, there are many kinds of source materials that might be relevant for the research paper you're working on, and these could include books, magazines, newspapers, scholarly journals, web pages, and non-printed media such as audio and video recordings, maps, pictures, graphs, charts, and tables. The first step in research is to develop a plan for finding the kinds of materials that will be most relevant for your paper, and in particular for answering your question and testing your thesis. A key distinction that students need to know, and which is unfamiliar to many students working on their first research paper, is between primary and secondary sources. Primary sources are raw materials that directly reflect the topic you're writing about. They are usually created by participants or others who lived at the time of the events you're writing about. Now, for example, suppose you were working on a research paper for an English class, which was a critical study of the great novel Moby Dick by the 19th century American author Herman Melville. What would primary sources be for that kind of research paper? Well, the primary sources for a study of Moby Dick might include the novel Moby Dick itself. The actual text of the book would be a primary source. That's some of the raw material that you'll be studying. Other examples of primary sources for this kind of paper might include Herman Melville's letters or notebooks in which he jotted down ideas for the novel as he was working on it. It might include diaries written by friends who recounted conversations with Melville. So perhaps some of the other writers with whom Melville was friends might have written down their impressions of Melville from the time he was working on the novel. And some of these primary sources might contain interesting and important information that would shed new light on the writing of Moby Dick itself. So all of these documents, which would have been created at the same time as the original novel, would also be considered primary sources when writing about Moby Dick. Here's a different example. Suppose that in a class on American history or African American studies, you were writing about the development of the ideas of Malcolm X, the great black civil rights and nationalist leader of the 1960s. If you were writing this kind of paper, what would the primary sources be? Well, some primary sources for this kind of paper might be the autobiography of Malcolm X. This is a book that was published after Malcolm X's death and was based on interviews with Malcolm X and then turned into an autobiography. That is the story of Malcolm X's life as told by him and published shortly after his death. Since these are words coming directly from the mouth of Malcolm X at the time that he was alive, we would consider this a primary source. Other primary sources about the life and thinking of Malcolm X might include newspaper articles that were published during Malcolm's life. For example, articles describing meetings or speeches at which Malcolm X expounded his ideas, and transcripts of those speeches or recordings of the speeches, either in video or audio form, might also constitute primary sources, as well as, for example, diaries, journals, and other impressions written down at the time that Malcolm X was alive. All of these would be considered primary sources for researching the life of Malcolm X. Now, of course, in most cases, you'll be looking at these primary sources in printed form. And in many cases, people's diaries, letters, journals, and other primary documents have been published for the use of historians and critics and students. And you may be able to find these at your local or school library. In other cases, there are primary documents that are still in unpublished form, and it's possible that you may be geographically close to an archive that contains the kinds of materials that would constitute primary sources for your topic. So, for example, let's say that in a history class you were going to write something about the history of your own community, perhaps when it was founded by the colonial settlers in the 18th century. You might find that the Historical Society or the library or the town archives in your hometown might have a trove of actual handwritten letters or other documents from those early days of your town's history, and those would also constitute primary sources, and you can get permission to go and study those, make copies of them, and write about them in your research. So sometimes primary sources involve going all the way back to original documents that aren't even in published form. Primary sources could also include, for example, interviews that you would do with people who participated in the events. Let's say you were writing about Malcolm X. You might want to try calling people who knew Malcolm X when he was alive and ask for permission to interview them. If you did this, then the transcript of the interview, that is the notes that you would take, or the actual document describing all the words and the give and take between you and your interview subject, that would also constitute a primary source because you're getting information straight from the horse's mouth, as the saying goes. So all of those kinds of information and documents would constitute primary sources. Now, secondary sources are reports of the research done by other people into your topic. Secondary sources are usually written after the events that you're writing about by people who didn't directly participate in those events. Let's suppose you're writing a paper about Herman Melville and Moby Dick. Secondary sources for this paper might include critics writing about Moby Dick, or a biography, a life story of Melville that was written by a scholar many years after Melville's death. For a paper on Malcolm X, secondary sources might include a biography of Malcolm or a history of the 1960s or of the civil rights movement. Notice that the same kinds of materials might be considered either primary or secondary sources depending on the topic for which they're being used. Here's an example. Suppose you were writing a paper for an art history class about the famous anti-war painting by Pablo Picasso called Guernica. As you might recall, this painting, Guernica, was painted by Picasso as a protest against the German bombing of a historic city in Spain named Guernica during the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s. Now, if your topic was the imagery of war as reflected in the painting, then if you went to the library and read a bunch of articles by art critics in which they gave their reactions to the painting and their interpretations of the painting, then you would consider those secondary sources. Now, on the other hand, suppose you were writing a paper about the response to Guernica and how the critics' response to the painting was influenced by their political point of view. You might, for example, be interested in a paper like that in showing how conservative critics who disliked Picasso's political views hated the painting, while progressive critics who agreed with Picasso liked the painting. Okay, if you were writing that kind of paper, then the main materials that you would be analyzing would be the writings of the critics. You would be reading those articles and analyzing how their critical judgments were influenced by their political views. That would mean that the articles by the art critics would be primary sources rather than secondary sources. So it all depends on what your focus is. The same kinds of materials could be considered primary or secondary depending on the underlying purpose of your paper. Now, for most research papers, you'll want both primary sources and secondary sources. Primary sources are valuable because they give you a grounding in the basic facts that you're writing about. They tell you how events were viewed by people at the time the events were taking place, which gives you a little bit of reality and helps you to avoid anachronism, which is the mistake of projecting back onto past times and events attitudes and ideas that only developed in later years. Secondary sources are good because they tell you what others have already discovered and therefore what you don't need to rediscover on your own. It may be that many critics have already come up with some of the same ideas that you've come up with about a particular topic. When you research and read good secondary sources, you'll find out what other historians, researchers, and critics and students have been writing about your topic. You'll know what's been said and therefore what you don't need to repeat. You don't need to reinvent the wheel, and secondary sources will get you up to date on what other scholars have found out about your topic and will help you avoid having to reinvent the wheel. Okay, this distinction between primary and secondary sources is something to keep in mind as you begin your work, and remember you will want some of both for the average research paper. Your first source for great research materials is the library, either in your school or in your community. And then in the next part of this program, we're going to talk about how to make the most out of your first library visit. Now, for most research papers, the best place to start your research is at the library. Now, I know what you may be thinking. If you've got a computer at home, you may be thinking, well, isn't it easier to start online? I don't even have to get out of my pajamas. I can just turn on my computer, go to the internet, and instantly find all kinds of information sources. Well, that's fine, and working online is easier these days, and it's also quite important. And elsewhere in this series, we'll talk a lot about how to make the best possible use of online research sources. The internet will be a tremendously helpful source of materials, and we'll give you some techniques to make the most of what's available on the internet. But the internet, at this point in its history, is kind of like a jungle. It's rather wild, untamed, disorganized, and unpredictable. There's all kinds of material there, but anyone who wants to can post items on the internet, so you never quite know what you're getting. And an uncontrolled search of the internet is likely to turn up as much junk as useful material. A library, on the other hand, is more like a city. It's civilized, controlled, organized, and planned. Once in a while, it's good to get out of the city and get into the wild atmosphere of the internet, but starting out with the organization of your local library is the best place to get a real handle on what's available, what's going to be useful, and what will not. If you start at your library, you'll get a solid grounding in your topic that will help you master the basic information that you need to know. And you'll then be better equipped to explore internet resources and understand what you see and be able to evaluate what it means and whether it's safe and whether it's reliable or not. What's more, your library, whether it's your school library or the community library where you live, has a wealth of resources that you may or may not know about. Not only books and periodicals, but also electronic sources, access to the internet and to specialized library databases, audio and video materials, and most important, knowledgeable experts on research who are usually very happy to be helpful. The main categories of materials contained in the library include the following. First, books of many kinds. This is what most people are most familiar with in the library. And you'll find there reference books, fiction and nonfiction books, general interest books, much more specialized books, old and new books. So certainly the open stacks of your local library will be a valuable resource filled with all kinds of books that you'll want to be able to refer to. And books in general tend to be among the most reliable reference materials or research materials that you can find. Books are generally well edited, when they're published by reliable publishers, you can generally count on the material to be more or less accurate. They are less ephemeral, that is, less fleeting in their interest than other types of printed materials. So when it's in a book, that doesn't guarantee that it's reliable, but it increases the odds that what's there can be counted on to be accurate and true. So books are almost always good sources for any kind of reference work and any research paper that you're writing. The second category of items in the library would be periodicals. Unlike books, periodicals are published on a regular schedule, and they include many different types of periodicals. For example, newspapers. Newspapers are valuable for research because they offer contemporary accounts and views of current or historical events. So if you're researching anything that happened in the past, newspaper accounts from the time will serve as primary sources for you and can often be fascinating. If you were interested, for example, in how people reacted to the painting Guernica by Picasso, you could go back to newspapers that were published at the time Guernica was first exhibited and read how people who were actually caught up in the politics of the day reacted to the painting. You might even be able to find in newspapers, for example, accounts of how pro-fascist critics from Germany and Italy, for example, reacted to the painting, which was a slap in the face of their government regimes. If you were doing research into the life of Malcolm X, newspaper accounts written at the time Malcolm X was alive and giving his controversial speeches would give you a sense of how both white and black opinion leaders of the day reacted to Malcolm X. So you'll get tremendous historical background by going back to contemporary newspapers and reading what was written the very day the events were taking place. Another type of periodical is magazines, which of course range from the very popular, such as People or Time or Rolling Stone, to more serious magazines like Scientific American, The Atlantic, or the New York Review of Books. Magazines would usually be considered secondary sources, although in some cases they might serve as primary sources when, once again, what you're studying is actually focused on the opinions or ideas that appear in the magazines themselves. For example, we know one student who wrote a highly acclaimed college thesis about the attitudes of the Russian Orthodox clergy to the revolution of 1905. She was interested in studying what religious leaders at the time thought about the political upheavals that were going on in Russia. What did she use as primary sources? Well, she went to libraries that contained Russian religious magazines published in 1905 and read what the Russian clergy were actually saying about the events at the time. So those magazine articles were primary sources for her in analyzing how the Russian church behaved and felt in regard to the revolution of 1905. So in some cases, magazines can be primary sources. Another type of periodical is the scholarly journal. Now, scholarly journals are like magazines in that they're published on a regular basis, monthly or 4 times a year, but they are highly specialized magazines which are designed to report research that's being done by scholars in particular fields. There are hundreds of scholarly journals in many topics, and some of them are now available online. Otherwise, you'd have to go to a college library or have a college library send the bound issues of the journals that you're interested in over to whatever library you work at. College research and also upper-level high school research is likely to draw on scholarly journals for secondary source material rather than magazines, because these are written at a higher level and delve in more detail into specific topics that are likely to come up in your research papers. There are journals in every possible field, from the sciences to the humanities to history, and often there are very specialized journals that focus on very particular topics. There are entire journals, for example, devoted to the writings of Shakespeare, for example. Recent journals will be more up-to-date than books in the sense that they will give you the very latest thinking by scholars and students in a particular field, whereas books tend to be a bit dated. Even a book that was published only 1 or 2 years ago reflects thinking that was done several years ago. So therefore, if you're concerned about finding out the very latest developments in a field, a scholarly journal would be a good place to turn. This can be particularly important in fields such as science, where changes are constantly happening and new discoveries may actually invalidate what was believed several years ago. So check the thinking in the field, make sure it's completely up to date by referring to articles about your topic from recent scholarly journals. And one last type of periodical that may be relevant to your research is government or organizational reports, which are often updated or released periodically. For example, most departments, divisions, or bureaus of the United States government issue reports periodically, which give statistics about things within their purview, not only government activities, but also information about related topics and activities throughout the United States and even throughout the world. One example is the Statistical Abstract of the United States. This is a large reference work that's published by the Census Bureau, and it's filled with fascinating, important, and very reliable data on every aspect of American life. It's available in most libraries as well as in online form. So government reports can often be a wonderful source of basic background information. They're issued in periodical form, which means that they tend to be very up-to-date and quite reliable. It's important to keep that in mind if you're doing research into any topic where the government might have a hand and might have some information that could be of use to you. Okay, what other kinds of materials are you going to find at your library besides books and periodicals? Well, there's all kinds of other printed materials. For example, most libraries have collections of booklets, pamphlets, and brochures, and these are usually kept filed together by subject. So if you have a feeling that the topic that you're researching may have been covered by booklets or pamphlets or brochures put out by particular organizations, whether they're historical societies or companies that are involved in a particular field, ask your librarian where to find the reference files, and she'll point out a collection of files that include all these kinds of materials by subject. And you'll find files there on topics ranging from cotton farming to the Iroquois Indians to the country of Albania and many other topics in between. So when in doubt, ask your librarian. You may find that there are a lot of booklets that are relevant to your topic, which the librarian can help you find. Another type of printed material at many libraries is subscription services. For example, there's an organization called Facts on File, which publishes regular newsletters on current topics. These are kept in most libraries in loose-leaf binders. If you refer to a recent issue of Facts on File, you're likely to find current topics of interest, things that are in the news, and you'll find all kinds of reference and background material about that put out by Facts on File in a handy, easy-to-digest form. Many libraries have collections of maps, which can include both old and new maps covering all kinds of information. If you're doing research on a historical topic, you may find that the map collection of your local library is a valuable resource. And maps could even be relevant for other types of topics. You could find for your art history class, for example, perhaps a detailed map of Spain showing the city of Guernica and relating exactly how the bombing took place, which might have influenced the imagery that Picasso used in his painting, might be relevant. Or if you were researching Malcolm X's assassination, for example, a map of Upper New York showing the Audubon Ballroom where he was murdered might be relevant if that were part of your research agenda. Some libraries have collections of theses and dissertations. Now, these are lengthy research papers written by either college or graduate students on particular topics, and they represent the latest scholarly thinking about a particular field. A thesis or a dissertation is usually written to complete the work for a master's or doctor's degree, and a student who writes a thesis or a dissertation is doing much like you're doing now, trying to learn as much as possible about a particular topic in order to answer a question and either prove or disprove a particular thesis or idea. And a thesis or dissertation is, in effect, a mini book about a particular topic. If you find that there's a thesis or a dissertation relevant to your field of interest, your library can probably get it for you. College libraries are the ones that are most likely to contain collections of bound theses and dissertations, but these are cataloged online, and you can probably have the relevant library that contains a thesis you want to see, have that sent over to whatever library you work out of. Now, libraries also contain all kinds of non-printed materials, which may be relevant for particular types of research. For example, many libraries contain collections of audio tapes and CDs, videotapes and DVDs, and access to various kinds of electronic information, including microfilms, microfiche, and CD-ROM. All kinds of reference materials are likely to be stored in electronic form, mainly to save space. So, for example, back issues of newspapers or magazines are sometimes stored in these forms, and your librarian can tell you what's available and how to use it. Finally, most libraries contain computer terminals which give you access to internet sources. This includes, of course, general materials from the World Wide Web, which you can access from your home if you have a computer, or from your school, as well as more specialized databases and catalogs that your librarian will have to help you to find and use. So, again, the first time you visit your library to begin work on your research paper, you might want to set aside a few minutes to talk with the reference librarian there, explain your topic, and have her walk you through what kinds of online resources might be relevant to your research work. Most libraries nowadays have special databases and access to catalogs which you and I may not use in our everyday life and may not even have access to from our home computers, but which your librarian can show you how to find and use. It can open up a whole new world of information and ideas that otherwise would be a closed door to you. Now, most of these wonderful assortments of materials in your library are going to be available to you in one of four ways. One is circulation, which means it's available for borrowing. This, of course, is the most convenient. And it usually applies to books, although some audio and video materials can also be borrowed from libraries. It's convenient because you can take it home, take your time with the source material, but not everything is available for circulation. A second form in which materials can be used at the library is in reference form, which means you can only use it in the library. That means you need to work very carefully through the material, devote enough time so that you're not rushing through it, and take careful notes. Be sure that you jot down accurately anything that you want to quote. And you want to also write down all the relevant bibliographic information. We'll explain what that means a little bit later in this program. But basically, you need to have all the information necessary so that you or anyone else can find the same source material again in the future, when the item was published, the correct title and author, and other basic bibliographic information that's necessary to get access to the same material. So whenever you're using reference material in the library, you need to gather as much information in as detailed and accurate a way as possible, since you may not have access to the material later when you're actually writing your paper. Luckily nowadays, almost all libraries have plenty of photocopy machines, so you can make photocopies of parts of the document that are most important to you. A third type of access that's available in most libraries nowadays is interlibrary loan. And this is a wonderful tool because it extends the availability of materials over a much wider area than was possible in the past. At one time, if you went to a particular school or lived in a particular neighborhood, you could really only use the materials that happened to be available in your local library. Nowadays, with interlibrary loan, most libraries are part of a consortium of libraries that may cover a geographic area or, for example, a collection of university libraries. So in most cases, any book that you can locate anywhere can be borrowed within a couple of days and sent to your local or school library. What this means is that the books of the world are, in effect, practically at your fingertips. It would be hard to find a particular book that was relevant to your research that you couldn't get sent to your local library. If you've never used interlibrary loan, ask about how to take advantage of this. There may be a form that you need to fill out and hand to the librarian. In some cases, it can all be done online. In the particular library that I use in my hometown, when I want to get access to a book that doesn't happen to be available at my local library, I can go online, type in the name of the book that I want and a special code that comes off of my library card, and within 1 or 2 days I'll get a phone call at home saying, your material is now available at the library. I just head down to the library and there's the book on hold for me. So any book that I want to see, really from anywhere in the world, can be made available to me without ever driving beyond my own hometown. Chances are this is available to you as well, and you should take advantage of it. And finally, the fourth way of getting access to library materials is, again, online access via a computer. If you have a computer at home, you can do most of your online research from there or from your school, if that's where you do your computer work. But nowadays, most libraries also have computer terminals that are available. Be sure you ask about what the rules are. In some places, you have to sign up for internet access, and there may be time limits since there may be other people waiting to use the computer. But remember, the librarian is there to help you use the computer and get the most out of it. So one of the advantages of using the computer in the library is that when you get stuck in your research, which can happen, the librarian is available to help answer your questions and help you zero in on the kinds of materials that are most helpful to you. Now, we mentioned that one of the four ways of getting access to materials at the library is in reference form. Now, in fact, the reference section of your library is one of the most important parts of the library. It's a large collection of books and other materials that are kept there because they're so important and so much in demand. They're not allowed to be circulated or taken home because the librarians want to protect them and make sure that everyone will have them available whenever they need them. Now, for most students, this world of reference books is somewhat unfamiliar and even a bit intimidating, but it can be an amazingly helpful resource when you begin your research. So in the next part of this program, we're going to take a closer look at the world of reference books so you'll get a sense of how valuable and useful this material can be for your research paper. When you're working on a research paper, the reference librarian should really become one of your best friends. He or she is a specialist who can guide you through the entire reference collection, and you'll be amazed at how much good stuff there is there and how much you can learn and save a lot of time by using the materials that are there. Start your research project by visiting with the reference librarian. Introduce yourself and explain your topic, and ask for some suggestions about where to start. Chances are the reference librarian has worked with other students dealing with the same or similar topics and can immediately point out this, and this book are ones that similar students have found extremely useful. So the chances are good that you'll find a trove of basic background information that will make the entire project easier and more effective. Your research won't stop with the reference material, but it's a great place to start because it can give you all the necessary background which will make a wonderful springboard for more detailed and sophisticated research that you will then move on to. Now, many of the reference materials are still in traditional book form. Others are migrating online. We're in a transitional period here in the history of print media in which some traditional reference materials are still bound in books. Others are now available both in book form and on computers, on the internet, and others have become completely online resources. So you'll find that as we talk through the different kinds of reference materials that are available, you'll need to work with your librarian to verify which materials are available in which format. The librarian can help you sort all of that out. There are 9 main categories of reference materials that every student ought to be familiar with. Let's go through the 9 now. First, encyclopedias. This includes both general and specialized encyclopedias. In our first program, we talked a bit about the Encyclopedia Britannica and recommended that you might begin your background reading by looking at what the Encyclopedia Britannica had to say about your particular subject area. But there are all kinds of specialized encyclopedias that are devoted to giving sophisticated information about more specific topics, and they can be a wonderful resource for background reading about any topic. Examples of some of these specialized encyclopedias include the Film Encyclopedia, the Encyclopedia of Architecture, the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. There's even an Encyclopedia of Censorship. If you were doing a paper about banned books, the Encyclopedia of Censorship might be one of the first things you'd want to look at. Here are a couple of examples of specialized encyclopedias that most people have no idea exist, but which can be tremendously valuable for particular types of reference that you're doing. Here's one called the Encyclopedia of Psychology. It's a 4-volume work containing articles about practically any relevant topic from within the world of psychology. Within a few pages, we read articles here about lie detection, which might be relevant to a paper for a criminology course, and life events. What do psychologists have to say about major events in life and how they affect people's development? All of that would be covered just within a few pages of the Encyclopedia of Psychology, along with practically any other topic related to psychology that you could imagine. You'll find in an encyclopedia an authoritative basic article that gives you all the current background information you need to start your thinking about a particular topic. Here's another specialized encyclopedia. This one is called the McGraw-Hill Encyclopedia of Science and Technology. And believe it or not, it runs 20 volumes. So again, you can imagine that practically any subject within the area of science or technology will be covered somewhere here. Within this 19th volume, again, within a few pages, we see articles on veneer, which is used in carpentry for making various kinds of wood products, Venturi tubes, which you know what those are if you've ever put together a backyard gas grill, and the planet Venus, complete with color photographs that show what scientists now know about the surface of the planet. So again, this is a 20-volume reference source, which is tremendously valuable as a good primer on any topic within science and technology. Chances are good that there is a specialized encyclopedia dealing with almost any topic that you might be writing about. A second category of reference materials is biographical dictionaries. These are books that contain brief life histories of particular people, generally famous people, of course. Some of these are national. So, for example, there's the American National Biography, a multi-volume set containing brief biographies of all kinds of people from American history, from presidents to artists to athletes. There are also biography dictionaries by field. So you can find biographies, for example, of people related to the world of movies, the world of dance, the world of music, the world of politics, and so on. And there are books like Who's Who, which are good sources of basic facts about a living person. So if you're beginning a research project about some statesman or artist or figure from history who happens to still be alive, look them up in Who's Who, and you'll get all kinds of basic background information from when they were born and when they got married to what school they went to and what jobs they've held. A third basic type of reference material is the periodical index. We've mentioned that periodicals, such as newspapers or magazines, are materials that are published on a regular basis. A periodical index lists all the articles in a particular periodical by topic, by author, and by date. And many periodical indexes also contain abstracts, which are brief summaries of articles. So a periodical index is a wonderful place to turn if you're looking for periodical articles about a particular topic. For example, if you wanted to find what the latest scholarly writing said about Herman Melville's Moby Dick, you would turn to a periodical index which specializes in writings about literature. And you would there turn to Melville and Moby Dick, and you would find a complete listing of all the recent articles about that topic. Nowadays, most periodical indexes are available online rather than in print form. So when you know what subject area you're interested in, ask your reference librarian, where would I find the periodical index for that field? And he or she can tell you whether to find it in bound books on the library shelf or in online form. A fourth important type of reference material are dictionaries of quotations and concordances. Concordances are lists of all the words used in a particular book or in the work of a particular author. A dictionary of quotations would be a book like Bartlett's Familiar Quotations. If you're trying to track down a particular word or phrase or quotation from a work of literature, one of these kinds of reference books can be very helpful. Now, a concordance may sound tremendously specialized and perhaps the kind of thing that you might assume you would never really need to use. After all, why would someone need to find a particular word in the works of an author? Well, suppose you were writing about Moby Dick and about Melville's attitudes and his use of symbolism in the book. You might very well want to know, for example, how and where Melville used the word Leviathan in the book. That's a word that goes back to the Bible to describe a whale, and Melville uses it for its symbolic resonance in the book. If you can find a concordance to the works of Melville or a concordance to Moby Dick, you can look up Leviathan, and every use of the word Leviathan in Moby Dick will be listed. Here's another example of a concordance. This one is called Harper's Topical Concordance, and it happens to be a concordance to one of the most important works of Western literature, the Bible. Suppose there was a particular phrase or quotation from the Bible that you wanted to mention because it was relevant to an attitude or an idea that you were describing in your research paper. This book would help you find it. Suppose you were taking a course in ancient history and you wanted to write a paper about relationships between the Jews and the Egyptians in biblical times. Using this concordance, you could find in one easy step all the places in the Bible where the country of Egypt is mentioned. Simply look up the word Egypt in the concordance, and 18 different Bible passages where Egypt is discussed are mentioned, saving you a lot of time leafing through the Bible searching for those locations. So concordances and dictionaries of quotations can help you to track down those fugitive ideas that you remember vaguely having run across at some point and which you want to refer to, but you can't put your finger on. Again, many of these resources are now moving online. Others are still in bound book form. Your librarian can help you find them. The next category of reference materials is atlases and gazetteers. These are books which provide geographic information, both old and new. Of course, atlases and gazetteers would cover how the world looks today, so if you're interested in nailing down the geographic location of things in the world today, you can find a current atlas or gazetteer. They also contain all kinds of information about places, from the main products of a particular region of the country or of the world to political information or business and economic information. And there are all kinds of specialized atlases and gazetteers that give all kinds of visual information about important topics. For example, there are books called the Harper Atlas of World History, where you can look up maps that would show the movements of armies and all the great battles of the world. The Atlas of the Second World War, which shows specifically how troops and planes and ships moved in all the important activities of that Second World War. There's the Illustrated Atlas of Jerusalem, if you were doing research on biblical topics or the history of the Jews and the Arabs in that important and historic city. The Illustrated Atlas of Jerusalem would contain all kinds of important background information. Here's a fascinating example of a historical atlas. This is called The History of London in Maps. And if you were writing about English literature, for example, you might well find that a map like this one of mid-Tudor London, which shows London as Shakespeare would have known it, might be very relevant in writing about Shakespeare's life and about the theater of his day. So whenever you're writing about any type of event that took place in a particular time and place, check to see at your library whether there's a relevant atlas or gazetteer. You'd be amazed at the kinds of specialized materials that are available. Another type of reference material is the chronology. Chronologies are books of dates which might cover one person's life, a historical sequence of events, the history of a particular nation or region of the world, or whatever. Once again, when investigating historical topics, chronologies can be tremendously helpful, and ask your librarian about them. Then there are dictionaries. We're all familiar with general dictionaries, which cover all or most of the words in a particular language, but there are also all kinds of specialized dictionaries which can be useful for particular types of research. For example, of course, there are foreign dictionaries covering foreign languages. There are dictionaries which translate from one language to another, and there are many dictionaries that are organized by particular field. You'll have dictionaries of science, for example, dictionaries of art, dictionaries of music, and there'll be dictionaries that cover particular types of words. Here's an example of that type of dictionary. This is the Oxford Dictionary of Modern Slang. You might be reading for an English class a 20th century novel that uses some kind of slang that you've never heard of before, and there's a particular passage you're trying to explain in your paper. You need to know what they're referring to. So, for example, there might be a sentence in a particular book that reads, "I don't care about the scrambled egg, but it may be a bit tough at first not being an officer." Well, you can tell that the author is using scrambled egg as some kind of a slang expression. Look it up in a dictionary like this, and it explains that scrambled egg means the gold braid or insignia on an officer's dress uniform. You can see how it got to be called scrambled egg. There are dictionaries that cover the language used in all different periods of history. So whenever you're reading material from a past time, when you come across words or expressions that don't make any sense to you, don't just pass them by, turn to a specialized dictionary, and you'll be able to figure out exactly what the author is trying to say. And then there are handbooks and source books. These are general compendia of facts and sources of facts by subject. And you'd be amazed at how relevant and useful some of these can be. I mentioned earlier the Statistical Abstract of the United States, which contains all kinds of census data related to the United States. Here's a similar book called Datapedia, the Datapedia of the United States for 1790 to 2000, and it contains population information, election results, information about economics, labor conditions, agriculture, and so on and so forth. And you'd be surprised at how relevant this can be to particular topics. For example, here on page 299, we have a chart showing radio and television stations, sets produced, and households with sets from the year 1921 to the year 1991. Now, let's say you were writing some kind of a research paper about American life in the 1950s. You might want to know, when exactly did TVs become commonplace in American homes? Well, a glance at this chart will tell you that in the year 1949, there were only 940,000 TV sets in American homes. That's less than 1 million. But within a year, that number jumped up to 5 million. And by 1955, just 5 years later, it had gone up to 30 million. So it was really the first half of the 1950s. That was the period when the TV was making its great penetration into American homes. A reference source like this tells you exactly what you need to know about an otherwise obscure and difficult to pin down fact. And the last type of reference material that it's good to know about are bibliographies. And these are books which are listings of books and other information sources. In many fields, there are bibliographies which offer complete guides as to the most important materials that you ought to know about if you're researching a particular field. So there are bibliographies related to all different literary figures, historical figures, forms of art and music, and many other topics. Nowadays, again, many bibliographies are moving online, but when you're writing about a particular topic for the first time, one of the first questions to ask is there a good bibliography of this field, a complete listing of all the most important things to read? Many bibliographies contain annotated listings in which they actually describe what each book or article deals with and gives you a real good sense of whether that particular source is worth looking up and reading in detail. So if there is a bibliography for any field that you're interested in, ask about it and spend a half an hour looking through it. You'll find it's a wonderful resource which will point the way for further research in that field. So all of these categories of reference materials are going to be available at your library, some in printed book form, others online, and I'm sure that several of them are going to be relevant to whatever research topic you're working on. Get to know that reference area of your library. You'll be amazed at how useful it is, and remember that your reference librarian is your friend. He or she will be happy to help you find your way through that reference collection and zero in on the books that are most valuable for you. Well, I hope you're getting a little excited about the wealth of materials that are available at your library. There's really a tremendous amount of great stuff there, and you'll be able to find wonderful, interesting, relevant things for practically any research topic that you can think of. But remember what I said at the beginning of this program about the difference between the internet and your local library. The internet has a lot of good stuff on it too, but it's kind of wild and unorganized, whereas your library is very nicely organized, which makes it easy to find the material. Now, the key to being able to do that is knowing how to work with the catalog, which is the guide to most of the contents of the library. So in this next part of the program, we're going to tell you about how to use the catalog and find the materials that are best for your research project quickly and easily. Now, the catalog may take a number of different forms. Again, we're in a transitional period. At one time, most libraries had their catalogs on little cardboard cards in long file drawers, and some libraries still use that same format. Other libraries, though, have moved on to other formats over the years. Some libraries have their catalogs on microfiche, which are plastic miniaturized sheets which you have to view through a special viewer. Some have the catalog on CD-ROMs, which have to be viewed at a computer terminal. Still others have the catalog in the form of bound books, actual volumes that you have to leaf through to find their holdings. And many libraries nowadays have their catalogs online, which means that you have to go to the internet and view the catalog using a computer. Often, the catalog that's online will include the holdings of many libraries. We mentioned earlier that most libraries nowadays are members of consortia, that is, collections of libraries which share their holdings, which is wonderful for you. It means you can get access to almost any book held at any of those libraries. Well, if your library is part of such a consortium, you will probably have access to the online catalog of the entire consortium. So any book that's available in any library in the group will be shown on that online catalog. Naturally, again, ask your librarian for help. Ask him or her where the catalog is and ask them to spend a few minutes with you showing how to use it. As time passes, more and more libraries and library systems are moving to the online catalog. And in fact, in most cases, you can get access to that at home, which is useful because it means you can get up in the morning, go to your home computer, do a little bit of online research, identify a bunch of books or other materials that you're interested in, and then go to the library to actually view the materials. So having access to the online catalog from anywhere at any time is tremendously convenient. Here's a little tip that most students don't know about, but which can be tremendously valuable. Try visiting the online catalog of the Library of Congress. It's available on the internet at www.loc.gov. This is a fantastic resource because the Library of Congress is the official library of the United States. And in fact, the law says that any material that is copyrighted in the United States has to be sent to the Library of Congress. So virtually anything that has ever been published in any form, book, film, or recording, can be found in the holdings of the Library of Congress. And of course, nowadays, through interlibrary loan, virtually all of these materials will be available to you no matter where in the country you may happen to be. So a good place to start your research may be with the catalog of the Library of Congress, because if you find some books there that seem especially pertinent to your research topic, chances are good you can either get them at your local library or have them borrow the book for you so that you'll have access to it wherever you may happen to be. So that Library of Congress catalog, tremendously valuable because it is so all-inclusive. Now, catalogs usually list each book or other material in a number of different ways, and navigating your way through the catalog can be a little tricky and can take some practice. So in this next segment, we're going to show you how you would go through a typical search in your library catalog and figure out how to zero in on the book or books that are most relevant and most helpful to you and winnow out a lot of other materials that may seem relevant at first glance, but in the end aren't particularly helpful. More and more libraries nowadays are moving over to online catalogs. And since there are particular techniques that you need to be comfortable with in order to find the proper research materials when you're using an online catalog, we thought we'd walk you through a couple of searches so you can see the kinds of pitfalls and challenges that can arise when you're using an online catalog. Now, naturally, every online catalog from a different library or library system will be a little different, but they also have certain characteristics in common. So what you find as we walk through this search together will probably be roughly similar to an online catalog that you'll encounter at your own library. The system we happen to be using today is from the Westchester Library System here in New York, but again, it's likely to be similar to what you'll encounter in your own library. We'll begin by clicking here on Library Catalog, New Search, and you'll see that we have a number of different alternative ways of searching the contents of the catalog. We could use any keywords, title browse, author browse, subject browse, and so on, as well as video, DVD, or children's keywords. Let's say that we are working on our paper about Malcolm X, and we're interested in research sources about Malcolm X's life, and in particular about his political philosophy. If we were to search under title, we would put in Malcolm X, and we would only come up with books that contained Malcolm X in the title. Not every book that might be relevant to us would necessarily contain the words Malcolm X in the title. For example, there might be a book, something like Black Leaders of the 1960s that might be very relevant to us, which wouldn't necessarily contain Malcolm X in the title. So for our purposes, let's do what's called a subject browse, meaning that any book that is about the subject of Malcolm X will come up. And so we'll enter the phrase Malcolm X, click on search, and let's see what the computer yields. Okay, we see here that there are several lines in the catalog devoted to Malcolm X. And we realize from the first two lines that the way this particular catalog treats the name of Malcolm X, X is considered his last name, and so it says C. X. Malcolm, 1925 to 1965, his years of birth and death. But since the 87 titles dealing with Malcolm X are listed right here on the computer, we don't really need to move to the letter X. We also see underneath the books about Malcolm X that a book or some other material about Malcolm X College is listed, and we see that there's one title listed, as well as one item related to the motion picture Malcolm X from 1992, one item. So clearly that grouping of 87 titles related to Malcolm X himself is going to be most relevant to us. We'll click on that line, and now we'll get some detail about those 87 titles related to Malcolm X. We see that the very first title listed here is the autobiography of Malcolm X, but notice under format, that's listed as video. So this is not a book, instead it's a video version or a video about the autobiography of Malcolm X, not necessarily terribly relevant to the type of research that we're doing. As we scan down through the titles, we can see any number of books and other materials listed here, some of which are likely to be more relevant to us than others. We can see, for example, that item 45 is called They Had a Dream, the Civil Rights something. There's not enough room on the listing for the full title to be given, but we can see that this would probably put Malcolm X in the context of other civil rights leaders of his day, such as Martin Luther King. So if that was the particular angle that we were most interested in, that would probably be the right book to select. Here we have a book, item 54, called The Life and Philosophy of Malcolm X. This might be appropriate for us since we're most interested in how Malcolm X's thinking had evolved over time. We click on that, and now we'll get more detail about that specific title. And here we have the author, Sandy Smith, the title, The Life and Philosophy of Malcolm X, a bunch of other information about the book, and at the bottom part of the screen, we have the call number. It says QB, Malcolm X, and a number of libraries are listed which have this book. So if we decide that this is a book that's of interest to us, we can ask our local library to put it on hold and have it sent over to us from whatever library has a copy available. However, notice under the description, this particular book is described as being just 80 pages long. That's a clue that it may not be that useful for our research purposes. 80 pages is very short. Chances are good this is either just a booklet or perhaps a book for young people, a kid's book, in other words, about the life of Malcolm X. Notice how you can tell a lot about the book just by studying the catalog listing. So we'll go back using the arrow key, and we'll go back to our listing of 80-something books about Malcolm X. And if we scroll through the entire listing and pick the titles that appear to be most relevant, by a process of winnowing, we can eventually come up with a handful of books that will appear to be relevant to our research purposes. And as I'll explain later, you'll write down the key information and then use that to get a hold of the actual book from your library. This particular search for Malcolm X was pretty easy because when we typed in Malcolm X under the subject heading, we just got a few listings from the catalog, including the grouping of 87 books all about the black leader Malcolm X, which was the subject that we're interested in. So that was a pretty easy one-stop shopping kind of experience. Let's do a new search using a more complicated topic and see just where working with the library catalog can become rather tricky. What about another topic that we've talked about a bit in this program, the history of the theory of evolution? Let's say that we were writing for a science class a research paper about Darwin's influences, the things that helped to shape Darwin's thinking about the theory of evolution when he first developed it in the middle of the 19th century. If we type in under Subject Browse the word evolution, let's see what kinds of titles or subcategories come up. Now under evolution, The situation is much more complicated than it was under Malcolm X, isn't it? We see at the top of the screen the word evolution appears with 362 titles. So there's a lot of books about the general heading of evolution. And then we have a long list of see also categories. In other words, related subject categories, any one of which might turn out to be relevant to us. For example, see also the Bible and evolution, and there are 4 titles listed. See also creation, 77 titles. See also evolution biology, 118 titles. See also galaxies evolution, 1 title, and so on and so forth. Now, we're interested in biological evolution. We're not interested in the evolution of galaxies, social evolution, the evolution of stars, some of these other topics that are listed here. So our first temptation might be to click on evolution related to biology and start scanning through that list of 118 titles. But one key is to be patient and to really search through all the choices before you make any decisions. Remember, we're interested in the history of the idea of evolution, where Darwin got his ideas and how he developed them into his own unique theory. So let's scroll down the rest of the listings before we decide exactly where we want to focus our energies. Okay, we have many more subcategories. We have a section labeled Evolution, Religious Aspects, Evolution and the Bible, and of course, if we were researching that topic, we would be turning to these headings. Then we see evolution biology, 118 titles listed, and underneath that, a group of additional see also headings dealing with specific subtopics underneath the story of biological evolution. And again, none of these is exactly relevant to the history that we're looking for. So we'll keep scrolling. And now we get to yet another list of subtopics. And there is quite a strange variety of subtopics here. We have evolution, biology, Central America. If we were interested particularly in the evolution of animals or plants in Central America, for example, then this might be a good heading for us. There's 1 title listed. Evolution, biology, comic books, strips, etc. If we were interested in locating a comic book about evolution, it would be listed here. We have encyclopedias, fiction, forecasting, Galapagos Islands, and now, evolution, biology, history, 9 titles listed. This seems to be the category that we've been looking for because we're interested in the history of the evolution of the idea of evolution. So we're going to click on that category and let's see what kind of titles are listed here. The first book is called The Ancestor's Tale, A Pilgrimage to Something. Can't read the full title. That may or may not be relevant. We have a book called Evolution, simply Evolution, edited by Don Nardo. Another title, Darwin and the Theory of Evolution. That sounds as though it might be appropriate. Let's click on that. We see it was published in 2005. And when we get the further title information, here's what we find. This book is by Robert Greenberger. Darwin and the Theory of Evolution is the title. Look at the length, 64 pages long. This sounds like another book for young people, doesn't it? Because children's books are usually short like that. I don't think this is the kind of title that we want. Let's go back to our list. Let's look a little bit further down the list. Here we have a title, number 7, Evolution, The Triumph of an Idea by Carl Zimmer. Copyright 2001. That's a fairly recent title, which is good. We know the more recent, the better. We click on that, and now let's see what information it gives us about this book. Okay, Carl Zimmer is the author. Evolution, The Triumph of an Idea by Carl Zimmer. Introduction by Stephen Jay Gould. Foreword by Richard Hutton. Published in 2001. And the book is 364 pages long, so it's a real book and probably a serious study of the history of the idea of evolution. And under notes, it says, includes bibliographical references and index. And we see that the bibliography runs from page 345 to page 352. This looks like a useful source for us. It's a good, solid, lengthy book. It was published recently. It includes a bibliography, which means we will get further ideas from this book as to other books that might be useful. And it also has an index, which means it's a serious book, well edited, and one where it will be easy to find specific topics. So this looks to me like one of the books we want to capture for our bibliography, one of the first books that we're going to want to use for our research purposes. Notice what happened when we did our search on the subject of evolution. We found that hundreds of books were listed and that many subcategories of topics were included. You really have to not rush into the first heading that you find, but instead scroll through the entire list looking for words or phrases that seem to fit in with the specific topic you're looking for. In our case, we were looking for the history of evolution, and by patiently scrolling through the entire list, we found a grouping of 9 titles that appeared to be relevant. We then searched those specific titles and found this one book that really works for us. So when you're searching through your library catalog, don't rush into the first heading that may be relevant. Instead, scroll through the entire list of headings, particularly when it's a complex topic like evolution, about which a lot has been published. Chances are you'll save yourself a lot of time and energy by only tracking down books that are really relevant to your topic, as opposed to following some wild goose chases. Okay, now that we've zeroed in on one or a few items that appear to be particularly relevant to our research, you might want to rush off, get your hands on those books, and start reading. But not quite yet. Let's stick with the catalog for another minute, because the catalog listing for any given book contains all kinds of useful information, and now is a good time to capture it. Earlier in this program, I mentioned bibliographic information. That simply means the publishing information about a particular book. And you're going to need that when you come to write your paper, because that bibliographic information needs to be reflected accurately in your paper. Otherwise, it's not a good research paper. So at this point, when you find something in the catalog that looks as though it's going to be relevant to you, you want to actually capture that bibliographic information so that you'll have it and you'll never need to worry about whether you've got it and whether it's accurate or not. And in addition, other items in the catalog listing are likely to actually be quite valuable to you. So let's go through a typical catalog listing, talk about what's there, and I'll give you some hints as we go as to what you need to capture and write down at the moment that you find it. If you're working with an online catalog, you can probably go ahead and print out the catalog listing for a particular book, which is nice because it means you don't have to write it out by hand. But if you're working with some other format of catalog, such as a card catalog, then you'll need to just get out your pen and pad and start jotting down the information as you see it on the catalog listing. But here are the kinds of items that are in the catalog listing, why they're important, and which ones you need to record. First, we have what's called the call number. This is the number under which the particular item is cataloged, and we'll explain how call numbers are determined in a moment. Right now, the important thing to realize is that you'll need the call number to get the book off the library shelves. So write it down in its entirety. Write down all of the letters and numbers that make it up. It may run 6, 8, 10 digits, something like that. Jot it all down. Believe me, you'll be glad you did, because it'll make it easy to find the book a week or a month from now if you need to go back and look up something that you forgot to jot down today or tomorrow. So the call number, that's the first important thing to write down. Second, the author's name appears. Write this down too. Of course, you need to know that. And write down the whole name, first name, middle name, last name, whatever appears. And if there are 2 or 3 or 4 authors, write them all down. If the author is indicated as being an editor, for example, rather than author, make a note of that as well, because you'll need that information for the bibliography you ultimately compile. The title and the subtitle of the book appear in the catalog listing. Write it down. Make sure you get it exact. Get the spelling correct. Get little words like a, an, and the correct. Those sorts of details are important, and if you get them wrong in your paper, your teacher may think that you're not paying close attention to details and may actually lower your grade as a result. Part of being a scholar means getting things right and being accurate, so get all the details correct. Next, the edition number, if any. Some books are reprinted, rewritten, revised, and updated from time to time. Some books that have been around for many, many years may be in a 3rd, 4th, 5th, even 6th or 7th edition. So if a book happens to say in the catalog listing 2nd edition, 3rd edition, that's important. Write it down. Sometimes different editions of the same book by the same author may be drastically different, and it may make a big difference which edition you're referring to. The American poet Walt Whitman, for example, published his poems under the name of Leaves of Grass many times from 1855 through the end of his life. And in each edition, the nature of the poems changed, the books got longer, the poems were rewritten. So if you're writing a paper about American literature and you want to refer to Leaves of Grass, you need to jot down which edition you're talking about, because in effect, they're really all very different books. In addition, the edition number may be relevant when you're deciding which books are significant for you, because when you're looking at research studies, historical studies, critical works, for example, if a book has come out in a second or third edition, that is actually a good sign. It shows that the book has sold well and is considered somewhat reliable or authoritative. It's an important enough book so that people felt it was worthwhile to revise and update it and republish it. So that's actually a good sign. If you're looking at a listing of 4 or 5 or 6 books, trying to decide which one to start with, if one of them happens to be out in a second or third edition, you might want to lean to that one, because that's usually a sign that a book is considered important and reliable. Next, the place of publication. In the catalog listing, you will almost always find the city where a particular book was published. Write this down. You need this for your bibliographic information as well. The name of the publisher is also given. Write this down. You'll need it for your bibliographic information. And again, the name of the publisher may be relevant to deciding which reference materials to use. The reputation of different publishers may vary. For example, a university press such as Columbia University Press, Oxford University Press, Indiana University Press, these types of publishers tend to produce scholarly books which contain footnotes and references, which may in fact lead to other sources. So if you're writing about any serious scholarly topic, a university press book is likely to be authoritative, serious, and also to be a useful research source for you. So a university press book would be a good choice. If it's a publisher that you never heard of, you may want to question whether this is a real publisher and whether it's a serious book. So the name of the publisher can help you evaluate how good the source is likely to be. But in any case, you need that as part of your bibliographic information. Write it down from the catalog listing. The copyright date will also be listed. This tells you when the particular work was published. It's a crucial fact. You want to write it down. You'll need it as part of your bibliographic information. And it's also important for helping you evaluate how current or timely the material is. In most cases, the more recent a book is, the better, because, again, in most cases, a more recent book will be up to date and will have covered all the recent findings in the field. An older book may or may not be up to date or accurate. Of course, if you're researching something that happened in the past and you're interested in knowing what people at the time thought, then an older book may be most appropriate, because that will reflect the opinions of the times. But if you find that there's a classic book in a particular field that might have been published 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, fine, go ahead, take it out and read it, but you'll probably want to supplement that by reading some recent studies, either more recent books or scholarly journal articles, which will bring you up to date and give you a clue as to what students in that particular field think about this older work. So if you rely on some older books, that's okay, but supplement them with more recent sources as well. The catalog listing will also list some of the main features of the book. For example, it'll show you how long the book is, the page count, whether or not it has illustrations, charts, whether there's an index, whether there's a bibliography. These kinds of details are not needed for your bibliographic information, so you don't have to write them down, but take a close look at them, because they will give you a clue as to how useful and helpful the book is likely to be. If you're looking for a lot of good basic background information on an important topic, a book that's 64 pages is not likely to be very helpful. A book that's 400 pages is much more likely to have what you need. If the catalog listing says the book has a bibliography, good. That's great news, particularly if you're early in your research project, because you can get that book, turn to the bibliography at the back of the book, and get an immediate list of some of the best sources of information about the field. So the bibliography can be a wonderful research tool in its own right. The fact that the book has one is an important sign. If you're dealing with a historical topic or a scientific topic, let's say, where illustrations, charts, tables, those kinds of things might be very valuable, then knowing that the book contains them will tell you that this is a book that's likely to be particularly useful. So look closely at the list of features that's given in the catalog listing. It'll help you decide whether a particular book is worth reading or not. Another item that's listed in most catalog listings is the ISBN. This stands for the International Standard Book number. It's a long, many-digit number, which is probably not relevant and probably not useful to you. You don't need to write it down unless there's a possibility you might want to buy the book. This is a number that's mainly used by booksellers, and it's a handy, quick, and easy way of identifying a particular book by number so that if you want to order it online or at your local bookstore, you can do that. Otherwise, you don't need to worry about the ISBN. There are other kinds of index numbers that may appear on the card. You only need to know the call number, the number that tells where the book is going to be shelved. These other index numbers are only used by librarians, and in most cases, they're not relevant to you. Finally, you'll find the subject tracings. That is, these are the headings under which the book is listed, and that indicates the range of subjects that are covered in the book. It can give you some clue as to what the particular angle of the book is, and may also suggest where else in the catalog you ought to be looking for other similar books. So making a note of the subject tracings can be useful. Again, it's not necessary for your bibliographic data, but jotting it down, especially if you're early in the research phase, can be very helpful because that can help you lead your way to other research sources. Okay, we've taken a detailed look at what you're likely to find in the catalog, and one of the things we've emphasized is the importance of capturing the call number. And this is a code that tells you exactly where you'll find the book in your library. Let's talk just a little bit about how those call numbers work and why they're important for you. Most libraries are organized according to one of two classification systems. The traditional system, which most libraries used to use, but which is slowly passing out of currency, is the Dewey Decimal System. You probably are familiar with this from your elementary school library, since those kinds of libraries are generally organized this way. And many public and university libraries still use the Dewey Decimal System to this day. The Dewey Decimal System categorizes books according to their subject area by number. The numbers range from the zeros up into the 900s, and as you can see, each different set of numbers stands for a particular general area of information. So that the zeros, for example, includes what's called general knowledge. In the 100s, you'll find philosophy. In the 200s, religion. The 300s, social sciences, and so on. Within a short time, you'll begin to get a sense of which sets of numbers are most relevant for your research project or indeed for your general areas of interest. And you'll quickly find that you can go to those shelves in the library and find the relevant books fairly easily. But anytime you're tackling a new subject area, you want to get used to the Dewey Decimal System that covers that particular subject area, get a sense of what the key numbers are, and that way you'll always be able to find the relevant books. Biographies in the Dewey Decimal System are cataloged separately under the last name of the person who is being written about, so that if you were looking for a biography of Malcolm X or of Herman Melville, you would look under their name in the biography section. You would find Melville under the M's, for example, as opposed to being in one of these numbered categories. When we delve a little more deeply, we see that within each of these broad subject areas, we get narrower and narrower slices of the particular subject by going into the second digit, the third digit, and then even into the decimals. So that we saw that the 500s generally cover natural sciences and mathematics. Let's say we want to zero in on Darwin and the theory of evolution. Well, we find by a little bit of experimentation that within the Dewey Decimal System, the 570s cover the life sciences, biology, botany, and so on. And the theory of evolution will be covered in books whose call numbers begin with 575 and 576. So if you go to those shelves in your library, you'll find many, many books about Darwin and the theory of evolution all grouped together there. You might also find, however, that some of the shelves nearby contain other books that are relevant to Darwin and evolution. So, for example, the 560s contain books on paleontology and paleozoology, which means ancient life. So if you're interested in dinosaurs, for example, or other kinds of early creatures, you would probably find those books in the 560s. So the nice thing about knowing the classification system, whether it's the Dewey Decimal System or any other, is that Because the books are grouped by subject area, you can find relevant books by serendipity, by getting to know which is the particular area of the library where your subject is most covered, and then browsing on the nearby shelves. Chances are good you'll find some relevant things whose precise numbers you haven't written down. So in the Dewey Decimal System, specific numbers right down to decimal places slice knowledge more and more finely. And the last initial of the author, that is the initial letter of the author's last name, is the final element in the call number. So if it was a book by Darwin, the last element in the Dewey Decimal call number would be the letter D for Darwin. Libraries that don't use the Dewey Decimal System use the Library of Congress system. University libraries primarily use the Library of Congress system, so it's good to get to know both Dewey Decimal and Library of Congress. They work a little bit differently, but the basic philosophy behind them is the same. Once again, all of human knowledge is divided into various subject areas or categories, which are then labeled separately. In the Library of Congress system, each listing begins not with a number, but with a letter, which tells which of 20 different subject areas the book belongs to. Some samples are J is political science, L, education, M, music, P, language and literature, Q, science, and R, medicine. We know that evolution is within the general area of science. If you were looking for books on evolution in the Library of Congress, you'd want to go to the QH shelf, because that's the specific area within which evolution is covered. In time, you'll get to know which letter or letters are most relevant to you, or which numbers in the Dewey Decimal System, and spend a little bit of time browsing on the nearby shelves, because serendipity, that is the ability of having happy accidents, will help you discover a book or two that may be very relevant that you didn't find on your first pass through the catalog. Well, at the beginning of this program, we said that one of the things you wanted to accomplish in your first visit to the library is to come up with a research plan. And the specific takeaway that you want to have at the end of your first day is something called the preliminary bibliography. This is a basic list of research sources that look as though they're going to be relevant to whatever topic you're writing about. It could include books, periodicals, articles, any number of other kinds of materials, and we've indicated in this brief whirlwind tour of the library some of the kinds of things that are going to be available there. So based on what you discovered during your first visit to the library, you can put together a preliminary bibliography, a basic list that will all fit on one page of some of the materials you're going to find and read in beginning your research into your topic. The kinds of things that you'll want to include in the preliminary bibliography include a few current and complete background books. These are books that will tell you all you need to know around your topic, and they'll provide context for your thesis, so you'll really be in a position to evaluate the thesis in an expert way. Your earlier background reading, which we talked about in our last program, which you did in order to get a sense of how to narrow the general subject area into a specific topic, probably mentioned the one or two most highly regarded current books on your subject, and those should certainly be included in your background reading part of the preliminary bibliography. You also want to list in your preliminary bibliography the most important primary sources. Remember, we said that both primary and secondary sources are usually desirable for a research paper. So at this point, you should decide which kinds of primary sources might be useful to you, and either list them or describe them in your preliminary bibliography so you know what you want to be looking for in your later research forays. So, for example, if you are writing about the intellectual development of Malcolm X, then the primary sources would certainly include all kinds of documents that would reflect what Malcolm X was thinking and saying during the last years of his life. So you might want to make a note that you want to find transcripts of speeches by Malcolm X, or newspaper articles or letters that he might have written. Those would be examples of the primary sources that you would list. And in doing some of your library research up to this point, you might have discovered where some of those primary sources are likely to be found. You might uncover some ideas for primary sources that you didn't think of before you began your research. Your preliminary bibliography should then also include at least 2 or 3 key secondary sources, especially those that are most relevant to your topic and to your thesis. So in basically any topic area, there are going to be a handful of secondary sources, either books or articles, that are well regarded, that everyone refers to, and that are considered important and definitive in discussing this particular topic. And you may find that there are some secondary sources that zero in very precisely on what you want to write about. If you're interested in writing about the symbolism of Leviathan in Moby Dick, chances are there are a couple of articles that have been written specifically about that. You'll want to capture the names of those articles from your reading in, for example, a periodical index that lists the recent journal articles about your topic, and that would become one of your key secondary sources because it zeroes in very precisely on the exact topic you want to write about. You may find when you read that article, it gives you some great ideas about things to say or not say in your own paper. So this preliminary bibliography, which might contain anywhere from 5 to 10 or 12 research sources that you're going to find and read, will make up the kit that you can use when you start your research. Now, what do you do with your preliminary bibliography? Well, you're going to use this to start you off on the more detailed phase of the research, which we'll talk about in quite a bit of depth in our next program. But here's another tip. If your teacher is willing to evaluate your preliminary bibliography, take advantage of that. Some teachers, when they're working with students, will announce in class, I am willing to look at your initial list of sources if you would like me to do that. Some teachers don't make such an announcement, but you can go up to the teacher after class or during office hours and say, I've got a preliminary bibliography, would you mind taking a look at it? That's tremendously helpful because your teacher is somewhat of an expert in the field, and he or she can tell you by looking at your preliminary bibliography if you're overlooking some work that is really important or really perfect for your purposes, or if you're including some items that may sound relevant but are really unreliable or peripheral, not really relevant, and may end up wasting your time. So if your teacher is willing to invest 15 minutes in looking at your preliminary bibliography and telling you whether you're on the right track or not, that'll be extremely helpful and will ensure that you don't waste time but instead zero in on the most important sources as you move into the next phase of your research. So we're now ready to embark on a much deeper research dive, and we're going to explain exactly how you go about that in our next program. Thanks for watching.
Even if you're class president, the star of the basketball team, and a nursing home volunteer, you'll probably find a rejection letter in your mailbox if your college admission essay is boring or poorly written. Now you can make your college application stand out from the crowd and end up at the top of the pile with video-aided instructions writing the perfect college admission essay. From advice on picking a topic to tips for sounding smart, this fun and easy-to-use program will teach you how to turn your admission essay into a showcase that really lets your personality shine through. Writing the perfect college admission essay can help you craft a memorable and impressive personal statement that sparkles with polish and panache.